Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second session of TRT World Forum's digital debate series, Designing the Future of Planet Earth Towards the Green Transition. My name is Michael Arnold. I am a researcher and editor at the TRT World Research Center. So today's session, we're going to be looking at the global impacts of Biden's climate policies and other related issues. President Biden's decision to rejoin the 2015 Paris Agreement and cancel the Keystone XL pipeline were among his first actions upon assuming office. As part of the Paris Agreement, Biden aims to cut carbon emissions by half from 2005 levels by 2030. His recent infrastructure proposal sets ambitious targets in promoting the use of electric vehicles, renewable power, and advanced clean energy technologies, as well as eliminating subsidies for fossil fuel. Regarding the possible outcome of this positive dynamism in U.S. climate policy, what kind of future impacts will we see in terms of global energy diplomacy? How will U.S. foreign policy towards market actors, particularly fossil fuel producers, evolve during Biden's term? Joining me to discuss these and other issues today, we have Mr. Omid Shukri. He's a Washington, D.C.-based energy and security analyst. Rana Adib, she's the director of Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st Century. And Paolo Natali, principal with RMI's Climate Intelligence Program. Thank you all for being here today for this really interesting discussion. Rana, I'd like to open up with you. So there have been many world leaders who have made pledges to get to net zero emissions by the middle of this century. Do you think that they've actually come to terms with the kind of massive transformation that has to happen in order for this to really get off the ground?
To be honest, I think one thing which we really need to underline is that there is a new norm of ambition, and I think this is really the encouraging message of the recent years. We also see that there is a change in norms in terms of not only at the national government's level, but also cities, of corporations, and we also see international players really integrating the net zero scenarios in their ambition. Unfortunately, and this is basically the part which is quite worrying, is when we're looking at the renewable energy transition, and I think this is something which is fundamental, 75% of the CO2 emissions are linked to the consumption of fossil fuel. So phasing out fossil fuel and moving to an efficient and renewable-based system and economy is key. And when we're looking at the renewable development, unfortunately, we're really not where we need to be. In the power sector, things are looking quite well. I think new investment are basically going to renewable energy. Over 80% of the new installations is renewable based. When we're looking into heating, cooling, and transportation, we basically only have a share of 10% or 3% in these sectors that are renewables based. So this clearly shows that the transformation that needs to happen needs to be much more structural and not only happening in the power sector, but in all economic activities of the countries. And just one last figure to mention, the investment in renewable power and fuel were in 2020 of 304 billion euros globally, 2% increase over 2019. But to meet Paris, on average, we would need 200%. So 2% versus 200%. So this shows that there is clearly a gap between the ambition and the reality.
Paolo, I want to go over to you and focus a little bit more on the Biden administration's approach. How ambitious are the objectives laid out by the Biden administration versus what Rana was discussing? Do you believe that they are actually achievable? And if they are, what kind of investment will be needed in order to make that sort of concrete transition away from fossil fuels?
So first of all, Michael, I think that it's important to mention that the narrative is right, and it's a narrative of clear change from the previous administration. The idea of coming back to Paris and everything you've mentioned that Biden has laid out so far. Clearly, the only way to solve the global problem of climate change is to have a global solution. The Biden administration is setting out the Build Back Better policy package, which is a $3.5 trillion package that compares, if you think of a country that has a $20 trillion GDP, it's quite a large maneuver, and 600 billion of that is for climate. As Rana was mentioning, it's a package that's very skewed towards the idea that clean electricity needs to happen. There are specific goals that the administration has set for electricity: 80% by 2030, 100% by 2035. So I want to say if the current ambition is reinforced by subsequent administrations between now and there, probably we are in a good spot to get us there on the electricity side. Now, is this enough to be climate aligned as an overall economy? Is this leaving us short in terms of energy supply? While I cannot answer the second question, I can certainly talk about what else needs to happen besides electricity. I tend to see the story of the transition as a story of four buckets of things, areas that need to change. One being electricity, of course, but then the second is transport. The main idea of the administration is to electrify transport, so move to electric vehicles. That has an inherent paradigm of private mobility in mind. Buildings is an area that requires attention. It's a tricky one too, because 80% of the buildings that will be out in 2050 are already built. So there's a story of retrofits. Is there enough investment in retrofitting buildings? There are about 40 billion in energy efficiency in the package for private buildings, and there's a federal green procurement portion of 17 billion that is about federal buildings. What I feel that really is needed to shift is industry, the last bucket. Supply chains eat up about 40% of global emissions, so the carbon budget is heavily dependent on how we decarbonize supply chains. There we need to send the demand signals. The idea of starting from green procurement, especially from federal green procurement, is sound. The federal government procures a vast portion of all the steel and of the concrete that is procured, so it will be able to drive the market. But this is the kind of lever for the future, and of course, if it starts from the federal government, it will contaminate private sectors, and hopefully will get us there. But there is more work to be done in that area.
Omid, just before I come to you, I'm just going to go back to Rana just very quickly here. If we're talking about the goals set out in the Paris Climate Accords, what would you say right now are the biggest obstacles to actually achieving those goals? Are we looking at something that's more political, more technical, a combination of the both? And sort of a related point to that, what impact, if any, is the US likely to have in this regard, either positively or negatively?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, thank you. I think it's a very interesting discussion, especially. I'll start with the technological one, because there is very often this idea that we need to have innovation. And the reality is we need innovation. You see, I'm not questioning this. But the reality also is that, and this is according to IEA, when we're looking to 50% of the global CO2 abatement needed, these can be reached with existing technologies. And these technologies are often least cost options. And I think it's something which is really important to keep in mind, that basically it is not about technical unfeasibility. We can deploy these solutions already now massively. So that's one aspect. In this context, I'll come to the hydrogen discussion, for instance, which seems like the silver bullet. And hydrogen is certainly really important especially when we're talking about the sectors like Paolo mentioned, the industrial sectors, steel, certain transport sectors. But the reality is we need to move to renewable-based hydrogen. And a big question here is PV and wind are least cost, can be deployed, and we cannot build a roof before building the foundations. And this is basically something we observe a bit in this technological part. Now, what is needed here? And I think this relates to the second part of your question. What are barriers? There are clearly drivers for moving to efficient and renewable energy systems. There are also draggers. The reality is we have an economy and also power dynamic that are clearly centered around a fossil fuel-based economy since 150 years. And this is very deeply anchored. And it is also anchored in fossil fuel subsidies, not only on the energy supply side, but also on the energy consuming side. So here we need another type of innovation, which is policy innovation. We need another type of innovation when we're speaking about the inclusive transformation that needs to happen. This is social contracts. And I think it's very clear that what governments need to do is fully acknowledge that moving to renewables and efficiency will not happen by only supporting those technologies, but by clearly banning fossil fuel out of our economies. And that is certainly something which is more difficult because there is also some resistance, but which needs to clearly happen for environmental reasons, but also economic reasons. Because today investing in coal, oil, and gas is actually doesn't make economic sense. On your question of the role of the US, I think very clearly the fact that Biden has joined basically the Paris Agreement on day one, basically, is really, really strong and important. The reality is also that there is a need for international collaboration and engagement of the G20 countries and the most polluting countries, but also the most wealthy countries to really engage in this transition and accompany also developing countries and supporting developing countries to engage basically in sustainable energy-based economies. So yes, there is really a very important role for the US to show the way. And just on the US part, investment in renewables in the US was in 2020 of $40.3 billion US. Fossil fuel subsidies in the US, direct fossil fuel subsidies, was of $20 billion US in the US. And this clearly showed that there is a need to integrate and align basically the different policy and regulatory frameworks, but also strong signals to market players to engage in the transition.
So Omid, we're talking about this transition, this there's ups and downs, but this sort of very clear, at least long-term transition away from fossil fuels. I want to switch gears a little bit and explore some of the potential geopolitical consequences of this shift. Of course, this transition away from fossil fuels has the potential to reshape geopolitical alignments around the world as countries become more energy independent, technology moves away from fossil fuels, etc. Policing energy choke points, spending political capital to cover, for the human rights abuses of, let's say, some of various regimes could become redundant, particularly for the United States. In theory, the need for U.S. military bases in the Middle East would no longer be there. In theory, of course. We know the U.S. has already reduced its reliance on Middle East oil, and we've been discussing how Biden has also set new goals to cut emissions and has received commitments from other world leaders, putting oil producers on notice. What kinds of geopolitical shifts can we expect in the coming years as a consequence of this energy transition? And are U.S. policies under the Biden administration likely to accelerate these shifts?
Yeah, this is a great question. Energy played a key role in U.S. foreign policy during, I think, all administration before Biden, during Trump era, Obama, George Bush, and Clinton. And the U.S. using energy relation to boost relation with neighbors and allies around the world. And you mentioned about the U.S. troops withdrawal from the Middle East. The controlling energy routes and energy research is a very key factor in international era, and all major powers such as Russia, China, U.S. trying to keep and boost influence in the region, not to import more energy from this region. Just try to get more geopolitical benefit and try to keep an influence in the region. All countries in the region, as you know, US, China, Saudi Arabia, UAE as an energy producer country, have their own plan to reduce dependency of revenue from energy export, fossil fuel, and trying to more invest in nuclear, solar, wind, and as Rana said, in hydrogen as well. Saudi Arabia and UAE last year and 2 months ago announced their own hydrogen program. We can see in the 1 or 2 decades ahead, all countries in the Middle East, especially as I mentioned, Arab countries and maybe in Iran after possible agreement with US and the Luton sanction, try to more focus on using own potential in renewable, solar and wind, and try to decrease dependency of exporting fossil fuel such as natural gas and oil. We can see it in the coming years, new balance of power in the region based on renewable energy and mainly renewable energy technology. I think in the near future, some private company from the US and also from the China try to more focus on the investing to high technology and innovation in renewable energy and trying to use exporting energy and financial capability to boost to get more international to boost to get more influence and political and economic benefit from the exporting high technology and financial capability in a renewable project. I think last week China officially announced that China government in the coming years trying to stop investing in coal-based power plant in the Middle East and in the underdeveloped and poor countries, and it is a very good step toward China and other countries to invest and export technology, and it's mainly in solar power plant and wind power plant. As you know, when Biden came to power, tried to impose new tariff from to importing new solar panel from the China and try to help to private company in the US to invest to produce more solar panel with low price and with high technology. And I think during coming decades, there's a great competition in innovation in renewable energy, especially in wind and solar. And as I mentioned, we can see new balance of power in the Middle East and around the world over getting more share of a renewable energy market.
Thank you for that, Omid. Paolo, if we're sort of, keeping not so much on the geopolitical side of this, but on the, I guess, both political and sort of investment side of it, one of the recommendations made in a recent IEA report is that in order to get to this point that we're talking about, is that no new oil and gas fields be approved for development in order to avoid the most catastrophic consequences of climate change. From your vantage point, how realistic is this actually, both politically but also from an investment point of view? And how might U.S. pledges in this regard by the Biden administration impact, I guess, these types of approaches, but also the global demand for fossil fuels, which of course could then, facilitate this idea of no new developments?
So first of all, the recommendations of the IEA look very sensible if you read and trust the IPCC reports that we all have read, and we do trust them. So whether that's realistic, I would go back to what Rana was saying, that we have the technology, the will is there. I know of no instances in the history of civilization when humans have faced the problem, acknowledged the existence of the problem, and haven't been able to solve it. So we will go there as to the realistic point. Now, whether it's feasible within timeline, it boils down to an analysis of how much we can serve the economy via clean energy. To that point, I want to say that no plan actually that is being proposed that talks about cutting all fossil fuels tomorrow. It's something that is phased in, and it's something that is very carefully politically debated through the checks and balances of a large democracy. And I'm referring to the fact that for example, some safeguards for fossil fuels are still maintained and being discussed in Congress right now. I'm confident that this will yield as a result something that is perfectly feasible for the US as a country. You were asking about the impact of the choices that the US makes on global demand for fossil fuels. Now, that would be quite outside of my remit to analyze, and also in general, the oil market tends to be rather unpredictable because of dynamics that escape the supply-demand balance, and so I would not have a comment on that.
Yeah, fair point. I realize that there's a lot to kind of take into consideration when looking at this, and it's not one factor necessarily over the other. And on this point of scaling back or reducing or eliminating investment in these technologies, we've discussed how the energy sector is responsible for over 75% of emissions that are driving up temperatures. We've talked about this report from the IEA, and Paulo's mentioned that it's a very realistic and sensible report to have no more investment in oil and gas. Yet, we still have the US and Canada are still exploring new oil and gas fields for development. The UK is still licensing projects in the North Sea. China continues to build coal-fired power plants on a very large scale, among other projects. So given this, how do we actually, from a policy perspective, how do we actually get to where we want to go? Again, I'm realizing this is a large question, but I'm wondering if you can give some insight into that. And how does this U.S. approach that we're seeing from the Biden administration, how does it actually factor into this on a global scale?
Mm-hmm. So I'll start maybe just also to complement what Paulo said. I think in terms of ambition, again, I think we are really on track, and also the Biden administration is clearly announcing this. When you see, and I take this example that basically the administration tried to end new federal oil and gas leasing, but it was a court order that required lease auctions to resume, so that the administration had to announce basically plans to open millions of acres of oil and gas exploration. So it is a court decision. We have other examples globally where court decisions push the governments to be more ambitious in terms of air pollution, in terms of CO2 emissions, and force the governments to also integrate this either in their NDCs, in their energy transition plans, etc. So I think this already indicates that we are today in an area where it's not only governments deciding about the policy and regulatory frameworks, but there are other players coming in. So courts play a role, and courts are being activated by different forces, I guess, when we're looking at the society. These can be obviously the private sector in the case of oil and gas, but they can also be civil society in terms of raising the ambitions. What we have also seen when we look at Shell, Exxon, and Chevron recently, so this year, that shareholders play a role here and can force, for instance, corporations to be more ambitious. And I think this is something which is really important and interesting to relate to. When it comes to the ambition, let's say there is a new norm. When it comes to really make it happen, it is very clear that this is a societal task which needs to be supported and accompanied by the governments. And I think that is something which is really an important learning, because the governments can also rely on civil society. They can rely on industry. They can rely to some extent on the finance sector to make this shift happen, because the norms are also evolving here. Let me come to the finance sector, for instance. There is clearly trends of divestment of fossil fuel, because fossil fuel investment are being estimated by some finance players as risky investments, as creating stranded assets. And this is something where basically the policy and the finance player can work hand in hand on defining new norms with regard to this. When it comes to the private sector itself and their ambition, we clearly see that ESG reporting becomes more and more important and has also trickle-down effect, not only on the local or national, basically, activities of the corporation, but on the whole supply chain. And I think these are really changes. We're speaking about a fundamental societal, economic, and systemic change that needs to happen, and where governments clearly need to work together with the different layers of society. One last context, and I think this is basically the other part, is there are citizens and there are regions that need to be supportive. When we're speaking about making renewable energy the new norm, it's about mainstreaming this. It's massive infrastructure. It's a major shift. And this will need societal support, which means like market players, but also citizens. And here we clearly see, in particular in some regions, that the transition and the preparation of the workforce, creating the citizen support, is fundamental. And I think that is something where government have a key role to play to really acknowledge for this and give the space for instance, community energy projects, which allow the citizens to directly benefit of the economic benefit of renewable energy, for instance. And that's to some extent, I guess, like the beauty of a decentralized, efficient, and renewable-based system, that it's many market players and many societal players that can even economically benefit from it. So we are really speaking about a very different governance structure that obviously also feeds into geopolitics.
Thank you, Rana. And so back to sort of a geopolitical element, Omid. BP and other companies have forecast a demand of a peak oil demand in the next few years as this transition continues away from fossil fuels. The consultancy Ward Mackenzie has said that consumption could experience a steep drop as early as 2023, and global prices for oil could drop well below $40 a barrel by 2030. If governments continue to push to reduce this fuel consumption. Of course, this would be a huge shock, and we're already seeing that to the budgets of oil-producing nations. If we continue to see this trend, which, as this discussion has been showing, we are very likely to see, how is this likely to impact oil-producing countries in the Middle East, and how does it, I guess, factor into their ideas of economic diversification? And from your understanding, your experience, how is that actually working out on the ground? Are there differences between the countries in terms of their ability to sort of move beyond their dependency on fossil fuels?
Yeah, this is a great question. Yesterday OPEC also released new report on oil market, and OPEC expected that by 2030, global oil demand will be increased by $160 million barrel per day, and the share of OPEC countries in global oil market also will increase. And at the same time, I think in all major oil countries has their own short-term and long-term plan to increase and boost investment in new oil field, and also try to increase production of oil. I think the last week Iraq and France Total signed a new agreement to develop new oil and gas field in the southwest of Iraq. Last years, UAE declared new plan to investing more than $100 billion to boost oil and gas production. Saudi Arabia as well, Russia and other countries as well. And if, as I mentioned in first question, if Iran and US sign new agreement over Iran nuclear program, we can see also Iran short-term plan for increasing oil production by more than 5 million barrels per day. At present, Iran produces about 2.5 million barrels per day. But at the same time, some countries trying to create balance, trying to more focus on renewable energy. But as I mentioned, the economy of these countries majorly dependent on exporting fossil fuel, and it is very hard for some countries to decrease dependency of fossil fuel export because of economic condition. As you know, during pandemic era, the oil price and decline. The economy of these countries was strongly affected by the pandemic and oil price decline, and some countries try to postpone and stop some project in oil and gas sector and renewable sector as well. But with regard to this condition, if countries to more focus on own potential and trying to more investment in, as I think that at the same time to both renewable and innovation, I think this country will be try to balance and will be control the energy transition process. As you mentioned, and all panelists are aware, energy transition process is a longer way, and we need more investment, innovation, more cooperation between private sector, between government sector, between all research center, universities, and other sectors. And the point is, I think I'm trying to sum up. The point is, there is some difference between energy producer country and energy consuming country in energy transition process. In the Middle East and North Africa, it is very hard for these countries if did not do according EU International Energy agenda, and if they did not focus on energy transition process, these countries will be face great economic problem in coming years.
So all of these things you're talking about, Omid, if we could take it back to the U.S. and U.S. Both energy policy in general, what impact is this likely to have on U.S. GCC relations in particular? And what will energy politics in the region look like as the U.S. continues to diminish its reliance not only on fossil fuels in general, but of course its reliance on oil coming from the Middle East?
Yeah, during First Gulf War and Second War, U.S. president, military president, were increasing the region, and during the Iraq War, U.S. also after the collapse of Saddam regime tried to more invest in Iraq oil and gas field, and after that also tried to increase military presence in the region. But in the energy transition process and in the investing in high technology in renewable energy, the U.S. has a good potential, U.S. private sector and also government has a good potential to boost energy cooperation in renewable energy and high technology in the GCC country. And I think last year some energy firm from the UAE invest in some energy project in the U.S. And dear panelists, please correct me if I'm wrong. I think, and also U.S. has a good as I mentioned, U.S. energy firm is hold a good potential to increase and invest in energy infrastructure in GCC countries and also in renewable energy. I think energy transition and renewable energy can boost U.S. and GCC countries because both countries need high technology and financial capability. We have good financial capability in GCC country, and we have good high technology and innovation in U.S. energy firms.
Thank you, Omid. Paolo, going back to this technological aspect, of course, we've discussed a little bit here as well. There's a lot of discussion and debate around new technologies or existing technologies that we have that will be needed in order to reach this net zero emissions target. And this is something that the Biden administration has focused on as part of this $1 trillion infrastructure and investment plan. So I guess sort of two parts to this. Do we currently have the technological capacity to do this? So that there's two parts to that, not just the technological capability, but when I mean capacity in terms of scaling it up to a level that is necessary in order to actually achieve those goals. So do we currently have that capability, assuming that the political will is there and the necessary capital, of course, is forthcoming? And I'm also wondering how might projects such as Biden's proposed infrastructure project facilitate the innovation that will be needed in the coming years in order to achieve these objectives?
So first of all, as we were saying earlier, the technology is already out there. So the tech that isn't there is tech that maybe we don't necessarily need, like carbon capture. I don't know. What is definitely necessary, and I'm speaking from the perspective of looking at where the US stands with a big investment in renewable energies to flood the grids with clean electricity that has certain different technical requirements when it comes to managing the the peaks and troughs of power supply, there needs to be a continued attention and investment in managing the grids. So electricity grid investment is paramount, especially this country needs more interconnection. The more a grid is interconnected, the least likely the different regions are prone to having blackouts. So that as far as the power grid is concerned. Then of course, if the plan is to electrify transport, that again is even more important that we look at the state of our grids and make sure that the right upgrades happen. And of course, specifically to transport, there needs to be an investment in infrastructure for recharging. We need to have plans that there will be changes in traffic flows most likely, and that also needs to be addressed. I mentioned earlier another aspect where attention is needed, which is the buildings. So we often forget how important the building load is, and therefore the emissions from buildings. In most of the cities in this country and in globally, most of the emissions, about 2/3, come from the building stock. It's and I already said earlier how tricky it is to build new buildings because it happens slowly. So a lot of attention needs to be put on efficiency and retrofits. The final part of what you were asking regarding how do we facilitate innovation? Well, there are essentially 3 ways that a government can do that. One is to do direct investment, subsidizing what needs to be subsidized, grants, and so on. Some aspects of the Biden plan do that. You can regulate out what is polluting, which is the first thing that one thinks about, but not exactly necessarily the first thing that a government wants to do because it's clearly unpopular. And the third way is to work on creating the right signals. So to try and make the markets work for you, to price in the externalities, I would say, with an economist's hat. So to try and make the polluters pay or actually reward production that happens in a more climate-aligned manner. That is actually the core of what I'm working on. So you see that I'm getting quite excited here. It impinges on what I was saying earlier around green procurement, the idea that you can create a differentiated market where you sell commodities that have better characteristics, better attributes, that stem from the fact that they have been produced via cleaner technologies, and that reaps a premium, and that premium goes to incentivize the whole supply chain to do better. You can do a lot of work in that direction as a government to create signals. As I said, the idea of having public green procurement is a good start, but that is definitely the area where I would suggest to look into the most, because it's one that modifying the markets, aligning incentives, works on its own, even if governments cannot agree.
So just to pick up on that sort of last point of green procurement, because I think you've touched on something really important here. You were speaking about it in terms of the U.S. context, but of course, as we've been discussing throughout this, this is ultimately a global scale issue, and if of course if the U.S. makes these big moves, it will have an impact, but ultimately we need this to be done on a global scale. So I'm wondering if you could just kind of extrapolate that a little bit and give us a little more insight into this idea of the potential of what you've referred to as green procurement to actually facilitate this on a global scale, and how might the U.S. either directly or indirectly facilitate that?
Yes. So over the last 20 years, what has happened in the largest global companies has been that they've started adopting targets for reduction of their climate impact, in particular GHG emissions. It all has started in the beginning from reducing direct emissions, and it is now expanding to the world of supply chain emissions. Many companies are starting to think or even have set targets for reducing the emissions that are embodied in their entire supply chain. That means that they will need to start procuring materials that prove that that those emissions are being reduced. And this is a tremendous opportunity because you have the largest manufacturing companies in the world out there actively seeking for the potential for procuring green materials, procuring green energy, which is commodities that have the special attribute of having fewer emissions in their supply chain. This is a new and emerging market. It's one that requires standardization that doesn't exist right now. So it's a ton of work, but it's a tremendous opportunity to tap. And as for the US is a country that is starting to realize that the narrative of trying to bring back sectors that have migrated away for a variety of reasons, because it's a new century, because they've been exported and so on, is not a winning narrative. The winning narrative is to invest in what can replace those sectors, what can bring back those, not bring back the same jobs, but what can create new jobs in regions of the country that are now suffering because of the loss of the old industry jobs, including fossil fuel jobs. This is also a great opportunity because it's a potential to position those regions as hubs for example, the generation of renewable energy and the whole supply chain that is around the generation of renewable energy. This is a way to bring new life to all the sectors, to all regions. And it's something that the US is starting to understand. Internationally, if it's not the US doing this, if that leadership spot in leading the way in making a solution to climate change possible, if the US doesn't take it, others will. We will see at COP26 in a month that there will be some positioning by other countries also to start making pledges. For example, Omid was mentioning earlier how China is doing something to stop the use of coal. Over time, other regions will also move, and this is a sort of leadership contest. And I believe the US has understood that this is ongoing, and it is willing to take that leadership. At least I hope so.
Thank you, Paolo. So, Rana, if we're looking at this, the scale of this energy transformation that's needed at this point, this, of course, will, as Paolo was mentioning, require leadership, but also really unprecedented global cooperation. Especially with regards to the assistance that wealthy countries will have to provide to poor nations who either lack the technical capacity or investment capital to actually to decarbonize. So can the US actually assume a leadership role in this regard? What would be required for them in order to do this? And is this type, from a policy perspective, is this type of cooperation something that you could see, one, being feasible, but second, actually happening?
It's quite a tricky question. Yes, there is very clearly a need for it. And I think this is clear, and every COP has basically come up with some tension, I guess, between the high polluting and more economic stable and rich countries, and the developing countries that have not been polluting historically, but clearly need economic support to build up their infrastructure. And I think what is really important here to mention is that in those countries, it is not about building up a renewable, efficient and renewable-based infrastructure and making a decarbonization happen. It is about building an infrastructure that allows to ensure access to energy for development and for economic activities. And I think this already shows that the entry points are very different. That's one thing. The other one is, and I think that's at every COP, again, discussions about the mitigation of existing CO2 emissions and the adaptation to climate change. And these countries are very often climate vulnerable countries. So they are highly affected by the climate change. And they need to build up resilient infrastructure. Now, it is very clear, and I think the IPC said that an annual investment of $2.4 trillion US, 2.5% of the world economy is needed in the energy system alone to limit basically the temperature. And this clearly means that there needs to be funding for adaptation, and that there needs to be funding for these developing countries to accompany them. And depending on the developing countries, there will be different needs. It's not always about the expertise. It's really about finance often. It's clearly also about preparing basically the workforce to be able to build up those infrastructures. And if you're asking, are things happening? I think there was a call for $100 billion US, and unfortunately, we're not there yet. So there is still a gap, and we'll see what will be the outcome, I think, of the upcoming COP with regard to this. There is a discrepancy again. There's clearly the ambition, the announcement, there's an understanding of what is needed, but the finance and the commitments here are not enough. Now, it is very clear that the US has been, and I'm sorry, I forgot the names. I think the numbers of the US commitments. They have increased to support developing countries. So I think this is showing a very good way. There's also an understanding. We even see philanthropy coming in, supporting those countries, but it is not enough. Now. And I would like to come back to what Paolo said. I think what is also really important is that there is an understanding, and this taps into geopolitics, a relocalization of economic activities, which is being discussed in the US, which is being discussed in Europe, which is being discussed everywhere in the world, when we see that basically the energy price will go up, that at one point carbon pricing, we didn't really speak about a global carbon price, but ultimately if we have a global carbon price or a price on pollution, this will very much motivate governments and industries, corporations to come back to local economies more. What is really important here is a localization in the US, for instance, or in Europe will also mean less reliance on export of our own economies, because this is like it's connected. And I think this is certainly something where the support of developing countries with regard to this, also there's a finance aspect, but there is also the trade aspect, and accompanying those countries to really build themselves renewable-based energy systems and economies with local jobs, with local technology production, to have really a resilient energy system and economy. So I think we tend to look at the finance aspect, which is obviously key, but there are also other political realities and trade agreements that will need to be evolving if we are really serious about reaching Paris globally. And since it's a global issue, it's really very clear that we will need to tackle this. And I think, just to come back to your initial question, are we able to do this? I think, yes, we are able to do this, but these are exactly the things where there will always be a certain tension between the cost-benefit analysis and who is on the winning side and who seems to be on the losing side. So somebody is frozen. I don't know if it's my internet connection, but if there is a question, I can't hear it.
It might be that Michael has frozen, but I think he's back.
Okay, good.
Although he is muted.
So I lost the internet connection there briefly. The wonders of nature are warning us here about my electricity consumption. So anyway, continue, Rana. I lost you there for a little bit.
Actually, I'm finished, but I would like to add one aspect, maybe, just to come back to the procurement questions, because I also think like this whole tension which we have in the localization of the economies also show that we have other players who have a key role to play. And I think that there are really opportunities, and I would like to end on not on a critical part, but rather on something positive. The transition also means that there are key opportunities, and the national governments, state governments city governments, so municipal governments, can play a key role by public procurement to also create market opportunities for the corporation to engage in the transformation. So I take a very concrete example, electric vehicles. Electric vehicles today in the US only represent 2% of the sales. It needs to move with the ambition which is there to 100% and needs to move to consumption of 100% renewable electricity-driven e-mobility. Now, public fleets can create the markets for the automotive industry to engage in this transition. And I think this is really, and it's a bit different. It means that the energy ministries and the transport ministries and infrastructure and agriculture, etc., all need to work together. I think this is certainly, if you ask about, one of the challenges. But there is a real opportunity about creating new types of economies and new local jobs and new local value chains. There needs to be internationally the understanding that this can happen everywhere in the world.
Thank you, Rana. And Omid, I want to turn to you on this sort of, I guess, maybe not as positive a point as Rana, but a related point in terms of this this ability to transition economies, not only away from fossil fuels, but as Rana is mentioning, to really sort of have the proper type of investment in industries that, as Paulo said earlier, can actually replace those industries. I just want to point to, there was a recent Verisk Maplecroft, which is a risk analysis firm. There was a report on the political aspects of some of this transition. Their report argues that Algeria, Iraq, and Nigeria in particular will be among of what they identify as the first casualties of what they're calling a slow motion wave of political instability over the next couple decades, resulting in large part from this projected massive drop in oil demand and consumption in the coming years. It also mentions that time may be running out for countries ranging from Gabon to Angola to Kazakhstan, who at this point have really failed to diversify their economies away from fossil fuels. So I'm wondering, on this point of economic diversification, how does economic diversification factor into the strategic outlooks of the world's largest energy suppliers? And how might US policies under the Biden administration, again, either indirectly or directly impact progress in this regard? And sort of if you're able to wrap it up with this idea of, as this sort of fairly bleak picture that this Verisk Maplecroft report is pointing out to, is it too late for some energy producers to actually go through that gradual shift? And will this move away from fossil fuels be a really big shock to some of them that could actually, as the report mentions, lead to political instability?
Yeah, I think it is hard to say it is too late to some energy procedure country to follow up the energy transition process and to diversify their own economy. But in some cases, and as you mentioned, in the Nigeria and Iraq and other countries, that we can see some excess of insecurity due to there is no strong central government to control energy infrastructure and to keep security in the energy procedure region. But in some cases, as I mentioned, we can see that it is late, but at the same time, we can see some political will to increase the share of renewable energy, to diversify economy, to decrease economic dependency of fossil fuel export and fossil fuel based economy. But after the change in any government in these countries, we can see that there is no political will. We need some mid-term, long-term, and short-term plan in these countries, Iraq, Namibia, Nigeria, and every party or every government came to power tried to follow this rule and try to apply policy. I think renewable energy and energy transition-based economic policy. In this regard, we can say that this country has a time to follow the energy transition process. But in some cases, as I mentioned earlier, it is late to these countries, and the instability in this region will treat the stability in the Middle East and North Africa, and it's affected also energy security around the world. As you know, we see the oil and gas flow from the Middle East, from the Strait of Hormuz to European countries, to China and Japan. Any insecurity in these countries is treated energy security and the national security of energy consumers, such as I mentioned, Europe, China, and Japan as well. The point, I think, to sum up that, instability will continue in these countries, and in the absence of a strong central government, we can see that instability will continue. And I think when new government came to power, tried to has own energy, foreign policy, and economic policy. And in this regard, we can see that some parties and some government try to forget the role of renewable energy and try to forget the increase the share of renewable energy, try to forget to decrease economic dependency of fossil fuel in these countries.
Thank you, Omid. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I want to really thank you all for the time that you've given to this discussion. I think as we've gone through this discussion, we've realized there's a lot of moving parts, and I think this is typical, I think, for periods of transition. There's a lot of unknowns, a lot of knowns, a lot of parts that have to come together, and a lot of different implications ranging from security and geopolitics to investment, to policy issues, etc. So, Omid, Shukri, Rana, Adib, and Paulo Natadi, thank you so much for joining us on TRT World Forum Digital Debates. I really appreciate it. It was a really interesting discussion, and we hope to see you guys in the future, hopefully in person at some point.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.